We now come to reading 18, Understanding Business Cycles. There are 4 stages of the business cycle, and a stylized version of the business cycle is shown right here. You can have an expansion phase, such as what is shown right here. This is where the GDP is increasing. The peak is the point where the GDP stops increasing. In this picture, the y-axis is your overall output or GDP, and the x-axis is time. A contraction is where the GDP is decreasing. Here we say recession, and as I've discussed in the examples which have been made available to you, the simplistic or the conventional definition of a recession is 2 consecutive periods of negative GDP growth. A trough is where the GDP stops decreasing. An important ratio to keep an eye on is the inventory to sales ratio. This typically increases late into expansions when sales slow down. Labor, hiring and laying off have high costs. In other words, it's not very easy to hire and it's not very easy to fire. Firms prefer to adjust utilization of current employees. So as the work starts increasing, rather than hiring new people, what most firms would rather do is just make existing people work harder. And only once a firm is convinced that the economy is out of a recession and the economy is growing, only then will a firm actually hire. Layoffs occur early in contractions and hiring occurs early in an expansion. Physical capital, used more intensively during expansions and less intensively in contractions. This slide summarizes the major business cycle theories. Your most basic theory is the neoclassical theory, and for each of these theories we have listed the causes of business cycles. So how does the neoclassical theory explain the business cycle? What the neoclassical theory says is that changes in the business cycle are because of changes in technology, and the recommended policy for those who believe in this theory or this school of thought is that we should allow wages and prices to adjust through pure market forces. The term used for these pure market forces is the invisible hand, that don't do anything and the invisible hand will just fix the situation. Then we have the Keynesian school of thought. According to this school of thought, aggregate demand shifts due to changes in business expectations. Contractions persist due to downward sticky wages. Downward sticky wages means that people are not very comfortable with lower wages. The recommended policy is to use fiscal policy and monetary policy to restore full employment. According to Keynesians, if we do not use these policies, then the economy might remain stuck in a recession for a very long time. According to the new Keynesian thought, other input prices are also sticky. Other than that, this theory is largely similar to the regular Keynesian theory. Monetarists believe that inappropriate changes in money supply growth rate cause the fluctuations in the business cycle, and they believe that the best policy is to have a steady, predictable growth rate of money supply. The Austrian school of thought blames the government. So they say that generally large fluctuations are caused by inappropriate intervention by the government. So the best policy is that the government should not force interest rates to artificially low levels, and the government should simply allow the market forces to correct itself. And then finally, the new classical theories. A major one of the new classical is the RBC theory. According to this, rational responses to external shocks. So external shocks happen, and the business cycles are just rational responses to those external shocks. And an example of an external shock would be major changes in technology. The recommended policy there is don't intervene to counteract business cycles. Just from a testability perspective, keep this high-level point in mind, that new classical macroeconomic models emphasize that economic agents should be represented in a utility function and a budget constraint. This is terminology taken from the curriculum, but simplistically all this means is that with the new theories, microeconomic concepts that we talked about earlier, such as the indifference curves and the budget constraints and so on, those should also be factored into the macroeconomic theories. So that's what the new classical theories try to do. Next we come to unemployment. You need to understand the different types of unemployment. We can have frictional unemployment, which results from the time lag necessary to match employees seeking work with employers seeking their skills. Then we have structural unemployment. This is caused by long-run changes in the economy that requires workers to gain new skills to fulfill new jobs. And then we have cyclic unemployment that results from changes in the business cycle. If the business cycle is at full employment, so at potential GDP we are at full employment, then the cyclic unemployment should be zero. And simplistically, when the economy is in a recession, then obviously the cyclic unemployment will be high. Unemployment rate, and now you need to know all these terms. To be counted as unemployed, one must be actively seeking employment and must be available for work. So if you are in the working age population but are not actively seeking employment, then you are not considered unemployed. The labor force consists of those that are employed and unemployed. The unemployment rate is equal to the unemployed persons divided by the labor force. The participation ratio is equal to the labor force divided by the working age population. In countries where more women work or want to work, the participation ratio will be higher. Discouraged workers are those who are available to work but not employed and not seeking employment. So notice that discouraged workers are not considered unemployed because they are not looking for employment. Underemployed refers to a person who is employed part-time but would prefer to work full-time, or is employed at a low-paying job despite being qualified for a significantly higher paying one. So I'm sure this won't happen to any of you, but say you get the charter and then after that you work as a bank clerk, then you would be considered underemployed. Inflation. So these are the different definitions. Inflation is the persistent increase in general price levels over time. Inflation rate refers to the percentage increase in price level from one period to another. Generally, the price level is measured in terms of consumer price index. Disinflation refers to the decrease in inflation over time. Deflation is the persistent decrease in general price levels over time. So notice the distinction between disinflation and deflation. If inflation is 10% and then from 10% the inflation comes down to 8%, prices are still going up but at a lower rate. That is disinflation. Deflation means that prices are actually going down. In other words, inflation is negative. Hyperinflation refers to out of control acceleration of inflation, which can destroy a country's monetary system and bring about social and political upheavals. The classic example that is often given with regards to hyperinflation is what happened to Zimbabwe a few years ago. Measuring inflation. A price index measures the total cost of a specific basket of goods and services relative to its cost in a prior period or a base period. It is used as a proxy for overall or average prices. So what happens is a base year is picked. For example, 2000 might be a base year, and then you have a basket of goods and then the price is set for 2000. After that, we look at the price of that same basket in, let's say, 2010. If the same basket now costs more, or the overall price is more, then that means that we have had inflation. The consumer price index is the most widely followed price index. It's based on purchasing patterns of a typical household. Other indices include the GDP deflator and various producer wholesaler price indices. Other measures of inflation. Headline inflation includes all goods and services. Core inflation refers to prices of all goods and services excluding food and energy. Food and energy are subject to high degrees of short-term fluctuations that can magnify or mask true inflation rates. Longer term, obviously, it makes sense to look at headline inflation. CPI tends to overstate inflation rates. This is a classic testable point. CPI tends to overstate inflation rates because of three biases: substitution bias, quality bias, and new product bias. You also need to understand three types of price indices. The Les Perez price index, that might not be the correct pronunciation, but it doesn't matter for the exam, as long as you can recognize that this particular Les Perez index is based on the cost of a specific basket of goods and services representing actual consumption in base period. So you set a basket in the base period and the basket remains constant, even though consumer patterns might change, but according to this index the basket is staying the same. Now this index is impacted by the biases such as substitution bias and quality bias. Why? Especially the substitution bias. Substitution bias says that, say in this basket you have a category of meat called mutton, and then over time, let's say that mutton becomes expensive, so people substitute mutton with chicken. So the basket is changing. People's actual expenditure then is not reflected by the fact that mutton prices have gone up. So the Pache price index addresses the fact that the consumption basket might be changing. And then the Fisher price index is the geometric mean of the Les Perez and Pache index and is termed the chained index. So just remember the fact, with the L you have fixed, and with the Pache the consumption basket is allowed to adjust based on actual consumption patterns. Alright, causes of inflation: cost push inflation. This results from a decrease in the aggregate supply caused by an increase in the real price of an important factor of production such as labor or energy. So if you have a situation like this, aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, and let's say this is your long run aggregate supply, market is in equilibrium. For some reason wages go up or energy prices go up, the short run aggregate supply will shift to the left, and if initially we were at point A, now we will move to point B. So the output has decreased because of higher costs, and this is called cost push inflation. So we have lower output and higher prices. The y-axis is the price level. Demand pull inflation results from the persistent increase in aggregate demand that increases the price level and temporarily increases economic output above its potential or full employment level. So if monetary policy is used, let's say there is an easy monetary policy that boosts aggregate demand, then what will happen to aggregate demand? Aggregate demand will shift to the right, and that will cause increased prices. I keep seeing this point related to non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, and I would venture to guess that this is a high probability item. But before I read the definition, hopefully you recognize that as unemployment level goes down, at some point there will be upward pressure on wages. Let's take a country, and just to make this simplistic, take a country like Spain where unemployment is very high, say it is at 10%. If unemployment goes from 10% to 8%, will wages start going up? Not yet. There will be some point, maybe after the unemployment goes below 4%, that there is upward pressure on wages. So this 4% is an important number, because it is saying that only when unemployment hits this and then starts going below is where cost push inflation becomes an issue. So this level has an important name, and that name is NAIRU. Sometimes it's also referred to as just NARU, but the moment you see N's and A's and R's, that's what we are talking about. This is the lowest unemployment rate that will not induce wage push or cost push inflation also known as the natural rate of unemployment. Leading, coincident, and lagging indicators. Economic indicators are used to assess the current state of the economy by analysts and to provide information about future economic activity. Leading indicators have turning points that tend to precede those of the business cycle. Examples of leading indicators are weekly hours in manufacturing, S&P 500 return, private building permits, initial unemployment claims, and real M2 money supply. Coincident indicators have turning points that tend to coincide with those of the business cycle and are used to indicate the current phase of the business cycle. Examples are manufacturing activity, personal income, and number of non-agricultural employees. And finally, lagging indicators have turning points that tend to occur after those of the business cycle, such as bank prime lending rate, inventory to sales ratio, average duration of unemployment, changes in unit labor costs.